If a fish can recognize itself in a mirror, does that mean it is self-aware, or should we redefine self-consciousness? Hi everyone, my name is Alexis. Today I will be discussing this paper written by Kohda and Co. in 2019, titled If a Fish Can Pass the Mark Test, What Are the Implications for Consciousness and Self-Awareness Testing in Animals? First, let's break down this research question together. So what is a mark test? The mark test is a self-recognition experiment that used to determine whether an individual recognizes itself in a mirror. By marking a colored dot in a location on his body that can only be seen in a mirror reflection. In humans, around 65% of infants pass the mark test by 18 months of age, typically by touching the mark while looking at the reflection. Beyond humans, several animal species such as chimpanzees, elephants, and dolphins have also been reported to pass the test. However, many other species fail to show this ability. The ability to recognize oneself in a mirror is often considered a hallmark of advanced cognition. Interestingly, until now, no vertebrates outside of mammals, except only one bird species, has passed the mark test. The mark test was originally designed for primates and relies on behaviors such as touching the marked area or changing facial expressions. But this raises an important question. Can the same test be applied to species with vastly different body structures and behaviors? To explore this, the researchers test whether a fish could exhibit behaviors that might indicate self-recognition. The fish selected for this study was the cleaner res Loboides demediatis. This species was chosen because of its unique ability to form mutualistic relationships with larger fish by feeding on ectoparasites found on their skin. This behavior requires the cleaner res to have a strong visual ability to detect and respond to unusual marks, making it an ideal candidate for the mark test. Beyond this, cleaner res show advanced social and cognitive skills, such as tactical deception and cooperation, suggesting a positive link to self-recognition. Now let's move on to the procedure of the study. Before applying the mark, the researchers first observed whether the cleaner res could pass the 3 behavioral phases after being exposed to a mirror. Phase 1 is the social reaction phase. At this stage, the fish sees its reflection and perceives it as an unknown conspecific. Phase 2 is the uncommon behavior phase. Here, the fish started doing repetitive, unusual behaviors that wouldn't be normally seen without the mirror. And in Phase 3, the fish begins to examine the reflection using the mirror. Once the fish successfully moved through this phase, the researchers put a color mark on their bodies and observed whether they attempted to remove it. The study included 5 experimental conditions, labeled E1 to E5. A total of 10 wild cleaner res were used. Initially, the fish were observed for 2 weeks during E1, collecting their initial response to a mirror, covering phase 1 to 3. Observations continued for an additional 2 weeks across E2 to E5. In E2, no marks were applied, serving as a control for the mark test. In E3, the fish received transparent sham marks. In E4, they were injected with colored marks with no mirror present. Finally, in E5, the mirror was uncovered to assist their responses. It is worth noting that all marks were small and brown, designed to look like real parasites. 2 fish had marks on the right side of their heads, 2 on the left, and 4 under their throats. These locations were chosen because they could only be seen in the mirror, allowing researchers to test whether the fish recognized their own reflections. Now let's talk about the study's hypothesis. Firstly, the researchers predict that if the fish try to observe the colored marks on their bodies in the mirror, they will adopt positions that make them easier to see the marks more often during E5 than in E2 or E3. Secondly, they hypothesized that when the mark was in the location that could only be seen in the mirror, the fish would scrub their bodies to try to remove it. However, they would not scrub sham marks or react the same way when no mirror was present. The results of this study indicate that during E2 and E3, the fish rarely changed their position to expose the marked areas. However, in E5, when a color mark was present, the fish spent significantly more time adjusting their position to fill the marked areas. This pattern was consistent across all fish except for one, regardless of where the mark was placed. These findings suggest that the cleaner rats spend noticeably longer time in positions that allow them to see the color-marked areas in the mirror reflection. Another key finding was that 3 out of 4 fish scraped their throats against the substrate when exposed to the mirror during E5, yet none of the 4 fish displayed this behavior during E2 to E4. Researchers have chosen not to include other parts of the mark because body scraping is a natural behavior in fish, making it difficult to determine whether this behavior is prompted by a color mark or simply part of their normal actions. Therefore, they only focus on throat scraping, considering it as the only potential evidence of self-directed behavior, as it was observed exclusively during E5. The mark test is a widely debated method for assessing animals' cognition, and it became even more controversial when applied to fish, as some argue that their cognitive abilities are lower than those of other vertebrates. Based on the findings, Kohda and co. proposed 3 possible interpretations. First, the behaviors observed might not be self-directed, meaning the cleaner rest does not actually pass the mark test. Second, the cleaner rest does pass the mark test, which would suggest they are self-aware. And third, while the cleaner rest might technically pass the mark test, this does not necessarily indicate self-awareness. These different interpretations highlight the complexity of studying animal cognition and raise important questions about how we define and measure self-awareness in non-human species. The researchers align with a third interpretation, suggesting that rather than demonstrating self-awareness, the fish might undergo a process of self-referencing, recognizing their physical form without possessing a theory of mind. Ultimately, the study highlights the need for further discussion and study on fish cognition and the broader implication of the mark test in assessing self-recognition across different species.